coming tonight. We're going to cover, I say we, but I'm going to cover a lot of information in an hour, and we'll have time afterwards for questions and answers, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. But because it's such a concentration of information, I ask you to stockpile questions in your head and wait till the end to ask, okay? We're going to talk about so many facets that I hope that if this is a topic of personal interest, you might have a notebook with you even. But if you don't, that's okay. Actually, Tiny House Northeast, the website, has a lot of information on it. But tonight is not a sales pitch. I'm going to be very frank, painfully frank, about the challenges, particularly about tiny houses on wheels, and also the advantages. But I'm not going to pull any punches. It's a interesting and new and developing area of a affordable and greener housing. So let's get started. I want to give you a little background. I earned a master's degree in regional economic and social development, socioeconomics. My mother says, just call it socioeconomics. But I focused in sustainable development and green building materials and practices. Our grandfather, as in Eric, my brother, you might see his name on an email if it goes out to you when you send something to us. Our grandfather was a builder, and he could build from the ground up. And that wasn't that uncommon. If there are any folks who are a little bit older out here, that wasn't that uncommon a couple generations ago, that someone could build from the bottom up. And I mean to say, to excavate and pour the foundation and do the stick build and the plumbing and electric and all of that, So I had that in proximity, and I actually had my first tiny house, a stationary one, when I was 19. And it is, because I still have it, it's about 350 square feet, a little under that. And it's 2 stories, and you can stand up in the second floor because it's not on wheels. All right. This is not a tiny house on wheels, but it is what we call the sleeper cabin. And the sleeper cabin was made to replace a tent. So go on weekend events with a historical reenactment club, and it takes the whole weekend, and our friends will be setting up tents, and maybe 11 o'clock at night, and maybe it's raining, and I said, heck no, I am not going to do this. And so this is a result of my refusal to set up a tent at 11 p.m. in the rain. And this is essentially all from scraps, with a used trailer underneath it and used scrap metal roofing, and worked out real well. Now, there's no facility in there whatsoever. It's just a place for 2 people to sleep and change and hang up garb for the club, and it's actually terrific. But anyone who's interested in the first project, this really worked out. It was great. Me and a couple of guys who knew more than I did about some framing stuff did this in a few days, and it was actually a lot of fun. And it has proven to be a really nice stand-in for a tent. So there's a big difference between there are a couple, but I'll touch on the largest differences between a tiny house that's stationary and one that's on wheels. The popular thing right now is this tiny house on wheels. How many folks here have seen the cable TV shows like Tiny House Nation? Or raise your hands, because I really want to get a count on this. Okay. Definitely the majority of folks have seen one of those shows. We've been on Tiny House Nation and Tiny House Hunters. It's a huge production. It's very much choreographed. It's very much a story. It's organized ahead of time. Those things that appear to be evolving as the show goes on were established months before. So it's just a show. It's the magic of TV. But we've gotten a lot of great ideas, and people have been really inspired by those shows. So mostly what we're talking about tonight, we're talking about tiny house on wheels. But back to the differences, a tiny house that is not on wheels needs to be built to building code standards, 100% residential building code. There's no cutting corners on this. So if folks will ask often, they'll say, well, what if we take our garage down and use that slab? Well, that slab doesn't have a frost wall to begin with. It's not thick enough traditionally. And so right off the bat, the answer legally is no. So that's a big deal. Now, when I say residential building code, we're talking frost walls and all of the energy efficiency, and then there's the pulling the permits and the excavation, etc. So you're not saving a whole lot of money, but what you do, you might find that you have at the end, if you keep it real small, is a very efficient space, one that you used less materials in and thereby being more sustainable, and one that's going to be easy to maintain over time. You know, even if you're quite up in years, it's possible to take a ladder and paint your tiny house that's, you know, like 500 square feet. So that's it for a tiny house, a stationary or static tiny house. It's just that. It's just smaller. Everything else applies as a normal house. And by the way, many towns have minimums as far as a house goes, the smallest house you can have. Oftentimes, that's a lot bigger than what we call a tiny house, being, say, about 500 feet. It's a little arbitrary, but that's a general consensus at 500 square feet. Where towns might say the smallest house you're allowed to build. Imagine that. They tell you how small your house can be. But anyway, the smallest house you can build is 1,200 square feet or maybe 800 square feet. Okay, so that's kind of it on the stationary tiny houses. Now, just want to show you a few possible designs for stationary tiny houses. As far as the differences go, we've got that nailed, but aesthetically, these are kind of neat. On the left-hand side, we've got a Victorian cottage, a Victorian era turn of the previous century architecture, and you can stand up in that, and that's real similar. That one on the left, that's similar to the one like I still have. And then the top right is kind of neat. Can you see into that? You see the bathroom, the toilet? So somebody, you know, I'm going to take a guess here. They used their backyard, and they had a very small footprint to work with, so they were real clever about it. They built up. I'm guessing there's a sleeping loft in the second story, though that's not to code, but there's ways around that, I guess. And, you know, it's not terribly pretty, but it's a very efficient use of space. It's kind of neat. And the one on the bottom here on the right, this cracks me up because it just looks like somebody started with a small, very small house, and then, you know, maybe the wife said, honey, we have another kid coming, and, you know, they built something else on it. Honey, I'm sorry, but we actually have twins, you know, and now there's another room and maybe one for the dog. I don't know. But this just looks like a conglomeration of tiny houses put together over time. Kind of cute. Frequently asked question is why? Why a stick-built tiny house on wheels? Well, there are lots of really good reasons. I could understand people asking that. I mean, it seems like a standard RV with, you know, it's sleek and watertight and, you know, everything's in it. You know, it seems like a really good deal. And for some people it is. It's perfect. But a tiny house that's stick-built has a lot of neat opportunities. And I know you can read, so I don't have to read these off. But essentially, you know, if you have the opportunity to have something that's healthier inside and outside, to use the materials that you want to use, to modify it down the line, you know, and actually, where before it was, or earlier, I mean, I say earlier, that's like a year or two ago earlier, because everything's moving rather fast in this realm of tiny houses. Maybe no one was accepting this as a stand-in for a standard RV. So say you went to a campground and you'd see, somebody would see a tiny house, a wooden tiny house, they'd say, you know, forget about it. This is not what we allow. This is dangerous. But as builders, especially like us, I mean, we take precautions to have things safe. We have tempered glass windows if necessary, and meet fire code safety and all of this stuff. And so over time, they're becoming recognized just like standard RVs. I'm just going to argue that they look a lot nicer. Who thinks they look nicer? Is it just me? Okay. Does anyone, okay, are you embarrassed? Does anyone love the look of a standard RV? Does anyone? No. All right, no one's going to answer me anyway. Anyway, so the opportunity to look really nice is there, but also to fit in aesthetically into our New England architecture. So you can have something that looks like a cape, or a salt box, or a, colonial or embellished Georgian or something like that. You could do any of that and have it fit into a neighborhood. And, even if there are minimums in a town for the building, perhaps the neighbors won't put up much of an objection to something that looks really, really nice, even though if it's tiny. I got to get used to using this clicker. So far, not so good. So based on the shows, we've seen things that look like this, and it's understandable. People are liking this a lot. I think a simplicity goes with this in our minds, and it's accurate to think about this. It's a simpler life. It's that we get to get this house business out of the way. House cleaning needn't take an entire day, or maintaining things down the road like painting doesn't have to be a big project that you have to hire out and spend thousands of dollars on. So life becomes simpler. And life becomes simpler also because you don't have much space inside to entertain. So all of a sudden you're not making the turkey dinner. It's just not going to be your role. You're not going to be entertaining many people, perhaps if at all. And so your life becomes outdoors. A lot of people will sort of adopt the outdoors as their living room. And then also too, another thing that tends to happen with a tiny house, where the quality of life comes in, is that people tend to do things that they hadn't been doing, that they'd been waiting to do when they retire, or waiting for some point in time when the kids left the house, or, well, wait a minute, some of you guys are the kids. But you know what I'm saying, that all of a sudden someday some time is going to be freed up. Well, with a tiny house, a lot of time is freed up. And so those hobbies of building things and making things, creating things, going out and taking photographs, really enjoying the local library or taking night classes, all of those things become more possible because you have less to take care of and less cost as well. There's no big, huge mortgage looming over your head. So you have to have 2 or 3 jobs. So we call ours wheelhouses, WEE. Our biggest concern in going towards design here is efficiency of space. So that's our very first concern. So we're less concerned than things are wicked cute, and more concerned that all the square feet are assigned importance. So that's not using every square foot, but that is assigning importance to every square foot in the tiny house on wheels. So these designs, these are ones that we've built, but they really just they're not super cute. Shutters aren't there, and they don't have a lot of architectural embellishment, but the way they're laid out, they're very much optimized for an efficiency of space. Can I just skip one? This is an important one. Hold on. Yeah. So, these are kind of critical measurements. Tiny house on wheels, one that would have require no special permits or license, is 8.5 wide. Okay, and that includes any sort of extension of the roof. So, when I say 8.5, I mean out to here, or the outside of the wheel wells, if you can see the wheel wells in some trailers. Okay, and that 13.5 high maximum, that's from the ground to the tip of the roof. They can be as long as 40 feet. We don't build to 40 feet. Most of us don't build to 40 feet, or 32. Imagine 40 feet's pretty darn unwieldy. I'm guessing that the length of this room is about 40 feet. Does anyone know? 40 feet? Say it is. So that would be, imagine that narrow spans and then 40 feet of that. But over 10,000 pounds, special license is required. So just a few years ago, things have changed a lot very quickly. Just a few years ago, people had an impression that you could take, if you were meeting that 13.5 high by 8.5 wide max, that you could take any tiny house anywhere you wanted to go. You can't unless you have a CDL license, and if it's over 10,000, you have to have that license. So let's see. I'm not explaining this very well. What happened was a couple years ago, 14 or 15 or 16 or even 18 feet long was common, and it was possible to stay under 10,000 feet. It wasn't discussed. So yes, if you stayed under that length, then you could stay under that weight, and then you could move around with a tiny house. But in fact now, just a couple years later, the median order that we get and other builders is about 24 feet. 24 feet is not 10,000 pounds. It's going to be a lot more. We're talking about stick-built construction, whether we have structurally insulated panels or whether it's just 2x4s or no matter what. So when you think about a tiny house, you have to make a decision early on if you're interested in doing this, are you going to just want to park a place and be there, maybe indefinitely, or maybe move once more, maybe down the road to Florida, where you hire someone to move it, or do you want to take it around with you? Do you want to camp with it? Do you want to go cross country? And if you do that, then you have to think about going below 20 feet to stay under that 10,000 pounds. Another thing is that, again, if you were doing some research on the internet just a couple years ago, and you'd put in, how big of a truck do you require? How big is, what kind of truck will haul a tiny house or tow, whatever, something in that vein. You would have seen an F-150 or Ford 150 or 250, but that was, again, for those smaller, shorter, tiny houses at 14 or 16 feet. They're not that big anymore. People realize that if they want to have some space to actually hang out in, then sort of 20 feet was the minimum length, with 24 almost being required for 2 people. And I'm not trying to artificially jack this up. This is what happens when we start talking to people and finding out what their hobbies and their lifestyle, how many people in their family, how many people will be in their family, do they have big dogs or cats, All of these different things will be discussed to help design this very specific custom tiny house. And in doing that, we never have anything less than 20 feet, actually. So it's unfortunate but true. So that jumps you not into the F-150 or 250, but jumps you up to, a 1-ton truck. And once you're up to 24 feet or so, even more so like having a dually, with dual axle truck, 1-ton truck, and you're not going to travel across country with that. That'll be, quite the gas guzzler. And remember, when you unhitch it, that vehicle will be your primary local vehicle too. So things are changing, but what's not changing is what the trucks can tow and what you're going to need to tow. Anyway, so just to reiterate, this is out to here, it's 8.5, that end of the roof. Then from here to the very tip is 13.5. And then everything from the bottom up is done very, very carefully so that you get the most headroom possible in the loft if you're doing a good job with the design. Now I'm going to take questions right now, sort of in the middle of things. And while I do that, I'm just going to go back to this. Are there any questions about what I've talked about so far? Yes, I'll repeat your question when you ask, sir, over there.
I'm wondering
Yeah.
Over
Okay.
time, and so you have special bracing?
Yeah, so the gentleman's asking about bracing and the sway as it's going down the highway. Yeah, it does sway. But the bracing, we do things like hurricane clips. So within the framework where you normally wouldn't do this, we put these special clips that are binding, vertical and horizontal pieces of wood in the frame. So that's one of the things we do. And another thing that's happening is that the framing of the tiny house is actually bolted down into the trailer. So they become one. The trailer and the building are one. So the trailer is the foundation per se. Another question? Up there? Green? Purple?
Yes, I was involved in that and trying to move off the trailer once. And essentially there's two things. One is if you get a permit to move it, then you can't go on interstate, for instance, and you got to do it daylight, whatever. Or the other thing is you got to register the trailer, and then it's got to have brakes and lights and so forth. I don't see any lights on it. Of course, I don't see the brakes.
Oh yeah. Well, all of the trailers that are used now, that we build with anyway, are all DOT. So the gentleman's asking about permits and lights and having all the safety equipment in the trailer. The trailer that you purchase for a do-it-yourself project needs to be for tiny houses and then should also comply with all the DOT requirements. So lights, reflection, brakes, you want to, there's a series of things that any builder, we do trailer orders too. That's a given, that all of those features are on the tiny house trailers if they're done correctly. Also, the tiny house trailers, by the way, are not the same as taking an old standard RV and ripping off the top and saving that trailer. That trailer under a standard RV isn't nearly strong or heavy enough for a stick-built construction. Remember, standard RVs are not meant to be lived in year-round. So they're very lightweight, and they can be. That's not the case for the stick-built tiny houses. So if you're planning on using an RV trailer, try to get the specs on it. But I can guarantee you that if the trailer is not heavy enough for a stick-built tiny house. Any other question? What more? One more? Yes, Young? Ooh, I wasn't sure if I got the question. The question is...
When you have static builds, you can grandfather in certain features of your house that don't meet those laws.
Oh, well...
But is that true with the wheelhouses, or do you have to also alter your living situation to meet?
Right. Oh, that's a good question. So she's asking if the tiny house's components could be grandfathered in like a stationary tiny house or stationary house. And I'd have to say the answer would be no, because there's not enough criteria that's already accepted. There isn't enough policy yet to even have established that baseline, right, to be grandfathered in to begin with. On the other hand, we specifically build to some RV criteria for safety, like fire code, and we'll use tempered glass windows. I mentioned that earlier. So we'll build to those standards voluntarily, plus build for the Northeast weather in addition to those. So that helps create a baseline, and within the industry. A couple of businesses do that, but we take that real seriously. And because of that, we actually get financing through an RV, a standard RV financer, because of the way we build. But yeah, I guess the answer to the question is it hasn't been around long enough to have some sort of universal standard yet. I love the design. The next one is cool. We didn't do this one. I don't know this guy, but I think I'd like to. This is a good design. I just wanted to point out a few things talking about efficiency of space and overall design. There's some real smart things in here, and there are a couple of things that we probably wouldn't do, but not much. It's actually a very good design. For one thing, aesthetically, it's nice. It has a lot of texture, and You know, they've done the roof in the back is over the loft, so it's at a very shallow pitch, and you're enabled to do that by using the metal roof because the ice and the snow roll off, and a metal roof is super. So you could have a 3 or 412 pitch. That's quite shallow like that. So that shallow pitch is sitting right over the loft in the back of that house. Perfect. Another great thing is they've used this skirting around the bottom, which works out great for the wintertime. You do want to remove that, though, in the spring. Wood construction lasts because it breathes. And we've got lots of turn-of-the-last-century houses and buildings in New England to prove that, because there was airflow that the buildings last. Do we have any architects here? You know what I'm talking about? Any builders? You said that you knew that. So having this nice skirting, keeping the building a little warm in the winter is great. Take it down in the spring. Looks like they have lots of nice windows. Being in a small space, having lots of windows, and the larger the better is a real luxury. Obviously, you're bringing in solar heat and natural light. It's more cheerful and a little more expensive to have bigger windows, though, I have to say, but they did a great job with the windows. One thing you can see is the trim beams that come out the front. One of those, you know, might be sort of a joist, but this at the end that's sticking out, we suggest that no wood is sticking out from anything, that you're always having everything under a shelter. And, you know, when that tradition to have that sort of architectural detail, it looks really nice, but in fact in Europe, those posts were, you know, bathed in oil, you know, to last. That's not the case with our wood now. So to have things last, have everything nicely covered. You know, that's ideal in any case. And you can see they've got all their proper venting outside, which is great, and just generally really, really nice design, nice colors. So there are two main kinds of roofs that people opt for by far. We're going for either a shed roof, which has just one pitch, which is on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side is a gable. And in fact, the one on the right, the gable roof has a couple different pitches, just like the house we saw in the last picture. So in either case, because of that metal roof, you're afforded a very shallow pitch, so you get a lot of headroom in the loft, which is awesome. And the space even over the living area can be very utilized too, because you've got this high ceiling and shallow roof. Say you ski and you want to store your ski stuff. You could store it overhead in that cathedral ceiling, you know, in the living space. The other end being the loft. Can you picture that? So works out real nice. Now, having a shed roof is a little easier to build, and so for the do-it-yourselfer, this might suit you better to be able to do this. Probably the only disadvantage, which is not a big one, but you know, the tendency, the orientation of the beds in the loft are going to be such that if two people are sleeping up there, one person's going to be rolling over the other person, if you can picture that, which tends to bother older people more, like me. I don't want to roll over somebody else to use the bathroom and get, you know, but for a lot of people, they don't care about that. On the other hand, with the gable roof, the orientation's different. The bed is going to be, you know, your head is going to be at the end of the building and your feet are going to be in the middle, and so you can negotiate at the base of that loft. And maybe there's a picture where I can illustrate that better than say it. Other things that are real easy to do that make it very efficient is to have the sort of a gardener's closet or utilities closet outside they have in this left-hand model. And a really nice feature that's so easy to do and so useful is to extend the gable roof on the right-hand side. You see, we typically do that with all of ours. We extend that gable roof out over the door. So you have this automatic, nice shelter, which is great for our weather, to have something to get up under when we go inside. And that could be, engineering-wise, I'm not an engineer, but I've studied enough to know that you can certainly get away with about 2.5 feet of that extension without having to have any special support or bracket. 3 or 4 feet, you do want to have some kind of bracket under there. Any teachers that want to argue with that? Anyone want to argue that point? Nope. Not the architects? Oh, come on. Is that true, though?
You can make it anything you want, you just have to support it with the
Okay. But at 2.5 feet, do you really need a bracket? Okay. All right. So good, because that's what we've been thinking.
Well, if they're holding together, then you're probably in the right.
Yeah, we've done it. Okay, good. Yeah, and they've lasted a few years, so we're good. All right. Any questions about very, very general architecture? Yes, sir?
When I first saw what you said as a garden storage shed there, I was thinking that was for propane tanks or generators or something. Do people generally go with an electric generator?
Oh, I'll talk about that in a while. The question was about the use of the shelter at this point. And the use of the shelter is probably not going to be for propane. I'm going to say don't store your propane at all if you're traveling with your tiny house. And, you're going to probably have, if you live in your tiny house year-round, your propane tank is going to be bigger than one of those little 20-gallon things. So you could make a platform for that. But the orientation for that propane tank is most often on the hitch end. And this is the hitch end. But, as far as garden rakes and things like that, this is super. You might have your 30-amp service breaker box out here, but we like to have it inside. That's a difference of opinion between builders. Now, one thing that there's some really fun-looking designs, talked about that before, like Tumbleweed. Tumbleweed's a great company that builds tiny houses. They don't have to build for as cold weather as we do, but I think that generally their designs do fit the bill. And they're so darn small, it's easy to heat them anyway, But they have a lot of architectural embellishments, extra dormers and, doghouse-sized dormer, doghouse-style dormers, and little nooks and crannies that are normally not a good use of space. So these little details aren't being illustrated here. But there are some really fun designs out there. And Tumbleweed definitely has a bunch of great things going on already that you could just buy and build if you wanted to. Oh, now I could show you about the bed here. This doesn't look it because of the camera angle, but this is actually a set of stairs, a legitimate set of stairs. It's not a ladder. So when you go up these stairs, the loft is long enough so that you can, shimmy over and get into bed in either direction. You're not having to roll over somebody else, if you know what I mean. So that kind of illustrates that. Now, we said every square foot is important. And so there are a few tricks that we apply, and I'll tell you ones to do and things not to do in here. Okay, one thing is a real space killer. Killer is the wood stove. So a lot of folks want to be off-grid, and they love the idea of wood stove, and frankly, so do we. But, with a wood stove, especially even a small, wood stove, there's a certain amount of clearance required. To protect anything from burning, right? So that clearance below you and all sides and above takes up a lot of cubic feet. All of a sudden, it's gone in a tiny house. So you're not going to have a place to put bookshelves or even hang your leather jacket, or you really are stuck having lost that space with a wood stove. So you want to get a longer tiny house if you want to do a wood stove. Just a heads up. And when I say longer, I mean minimum 24 feet and longer. And then you're back to that big hog of a truck to tow it, and then possibly the CDL license, too, to legally tow it. On the other hand, a wall-mounted propane heater still has a certain requirement of clearance above it, beside it, but those specs come with the components. You can look that stuff up. because we custom design everything. This is what you do. This is works for us. One component at a time. We go to Amazon and some of the other sites, and we find out what the specs are. That's what you would probably be doing as well. Now, another space-saving one on the positive is to have the counter not be a standard 26 inches, but have it 22, and you can get sinks that will fit in there. On the negative side, though, don't do this, is don't have an in-swing door. There's normally just one door in a tiny house, and that one door should swing out. So this door here swings in. That means that if the door's 36 inches wide, you've just lost 9 square feet of footprint like that. Now, if it swung out, you could still cheat a little bit, have a chair or a couch close by to the door, still be able to get in the door. So always have an outswing door, and don't worry about mosquitoes. They sell these great things. They have magnets. They put the magnet in the inside frame, and then there's a screen mesh that is also magnetized and fits over that with flaps. It works great, and that's a way around that little issue of having an outswing door. Another thing too about space and trying to claim as much of it as you can is, as I said before, you're thinking about every step all the way from the ground up. So if you can get a trailer that sits a bit lower with, say, drop axles, which cost a bit more, but you could do that and save a few inches, maybe 2 or 4 inches. So instead of the standard 24 inches, you're going to have 20 or 22 inches. And then think about every layer as you go up. Having a nice hardwood floor at 3/4 of an inch might not be such a good idea, especially if you're a tall person and you want something left over in the loft, right? So, think about maybe a laminate floor on top of your subfloor. A lot of times our kitchen height is only 6'4" or 5 inches, and that is suitable for most people. Now, of course, if you're a very tall person and you're already 6'4", 6'5", you will be miserably uncomfortable thinking you're going to hit your head constantly, so then you don't design that way. But on average, a 6'4", 6'5" height in the ceiling here is really fine. And so, you see what I mean, though? You're thinking about every layer of this so that at the end of it all, you've left something as much as possible in the loft. Now, the way that we design the lofts, and you can do this, is I really can sit down in the loft. I can sit just like this and not have this sense that anything is just about to hit me, okay? You can also scoot around. And remember, you've got that shallow pitch over your head. You can scoot around comfortably at this height under most of the loft roof. So if you've seen pictures of these like tiny little crawl spaces, it's not necessary to have that. You can be really comfortable. And with stairs and enough room to scoot around in, like this, most people can negotiate that, can live with that for a very long time in their life, So there's just some options, whereas ladders are pretty tough. Any questions about design? Kind of. Yes, sir? Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah, so the gentleman asked both about building code heights and about an egress, way to get out. Now, we do build an egress in the second floor, and which is usually like an awning window that just you pop out and you can get out that way. Here's the thing. Tiny houses don't follow code. We voluntarily build them to as close to code as we can, thinking mostly about safety. So particularly fire safety. So those and tempered glass window, which I keep saying that, and those are very expensive, by the way. So we're not meeting code. We're doing some sort of a balancing act between it's standard construction and what RVs do to be certified. We're dancing in the middle there. There are a lot of do-it-yourselfers, especially in years, past, that did a pretty crazy job of putting things together. Well-intentioned, hard work. Sometimes they looked great, and you really have to commend anybody who's working that hard to do something on their own. However, there's been a lot of safety issues with some of these do-it-yourself projects. We don't do things like that. Now, so it's not meeting code for stairs. It's not meeting, for the treads and risers. It's not meeting code for heights of the ceiling. It's not meeting codes for energy efficiency in terms of the insulation of the walls. We're just doing the best we can to suit that particular environment with a focus on safety. So it's pretty different. But someday that might change. There's an evolution happening as I speak. Any other questions on sort of design? Yes, sir. Okay, so we never use sheetrock because we're always under the assumption they're traveling. Right, no sheetrock. So on the right-hand side, we've got a 4x8 bead paneling, which looks great, paints up great. If you want to cherry pick them, if you go to your lumber yard, and we encourage people to go to your local lumber yards for everything. You can cherry pick and get the nice looking panels, the beadboard, and without the nicks and stuff, and they look great. You could just oil them up or poly or whatever if you don't mind the smell. Or they paint up white like we did, and it just makes the room feel so big. And it has a nice cottagey sort of Cape Coddy look, I guess people say. On the top left, that's a V-joint board, all pine, and it's not treated. We just treat pine on the outside. Yes? Yeah. So the question is about having a main bedroom on the main floor instead of the loft. Certainly. It just means that it's necessarily going to be a much longer building. So what might have been 24 feet is now 28 feet. And then the orientation of the other rooms is going to be quite different. So it poses some challenges, but it certainly can be done. Percentage-wise, it's probably like 10% or less. More inquiries than actually going forward with plans. I get more inquiries than we actually do the plans for. Now, I do want to mention, too, that the best place for the bathroom is actually the hitch end. I mean, there are optimums. There are the best practices for the placement of everything because it's so small. There's just not that much variety. So when I say this, I'm not saying that no one's ever done it another way and it would not work another way. I'm just saying this is the best use on average. The bathroom is on the end of the tiny house, on the hitch end. So it's spanning the width of the tiny house, and then that plumbing, particularly the shower, is abutting the wall, a chase wall, on the other side of which is the kitchen and the sink, okay? Another thing to do is the best orientation is a door on the other end, okay? With the ability to shelter that door because of a little bit of the extended roof going over it, whether it's a couple or a few feet like I talked about before, or just 9 inches or something. But that the ends of the gable afford you that opportunity to have an extra shelter. If you put the door on the side, you can do that, sure. But then remember, you've only got 8.5 wide, so putting that on the side presents some protection issues for the door. Okay. So there's some other rules like that, but I shouldn't get too deep into that. You're going to fall asleep. Yes, sir.
Talk a little bit about water, gray water, waste.
Yeah. I'm going to talk all about all that. How are we doing on time? Oh my God, I'm talking for almost an hour already. All right, I'm going to speed this up. I hadn't realized that. So, utilities, we can do things, one of two ways, really. You can think of it as an RV, a standard RV. So it can be equipped just like an RV, hooking up to a 30 or 50 amp service and having an RV style toilet, which is like a marine toilet. You just need a little bit of water and it flushes your waste into a black water tank. All of those attributes in a standard RV could be applied in the tiny house on wheels, and we do that sometimes. But more often, people are using alternatives. And so first I'll talk about sewage. Most people are opting for composting toilets, but there are a couple versions of over-the-floor toilets, so nothing's going below the floor, so nothing goes below the floor to freeze, okay? And those options include a incinerating toilet, which incinerating, just like it sounds, it burns your waste. And then the other one that I'll talk about, because I'm not talking about chemical toilets and sustainability, but the other one's a composting toilet. The composting toilet's a lot of work, but it is the most popular option. The composting toilet works like this in its most basic form. You got a bucket, you got a natural medium like peat moss. You throw the peat moss in the bottom of the bucket, you do your thing, and you throw more peat moss on top of that. And then you pay attention, and when it's going to hit your butt, and you take that bucket outside, and then you have to walk it to someplace where, it's not going to infringe on anyone's enjoyment to walk around or step in it, and you have to pay attention to how long it's been there. So this option doesn't work in the suburbs, and it doesn't work in the city at all, period. You're not going to put your poop in the trash. So in a country setting, you're going to be taking that compost out, you're going to be walking it away, and you're going to keep track of how old the piles are, because it takes a couple years for the pathogens to process in such a way that it becomes compost. Until then, it's compost in progress, okay? Now that could also be burned outside as well to speed up that process, which could be a nice space saver outside. Quickly back to the incinerating toilet. It's a little smelly, but it vents to the outside, and people will maybe burn overnight and not really disturb too many people. That works too. Now, with the composting toilet, there is an interesting thing about the composting toilet that I had always been surprised to hear. The poop doesn't actually smell that bad. It's the pee, it's the urine. Within a couple days, if anyone here hasn't flushed a toilet, has a camp, or doesn't flush every single time, it smells pretty bad pretty quickly. So there are toilets now that are made that actually have a separate compartment for the urine and another one for the solids. And like cat litter, the poop dries up, So it's the urine that you actually end up having to dump frequently, possibly every day. So the compost toilet is a serious thought for those folks that might have a hard time getting outside, maybe in several feet of snow to empty their toilets. But right now it's the most popular way to go. So this, I believe, is a version that separates the urine from the feces, and that one on the left-hand side is just neat. That's somebody evidently hollowed out a log. I'm guessing there's a bucket inside of it, and they bought a wood cover to go on that, which is great. And by the way, you can buy these sort of rubbery toilet tops that look just like that wooden one, only it's out of plastic. Spend a couple more bucks for the nicer one. It's rubbery and won't crack and will withstand some weight. And then you can also get 7-gallon buckets, which stand about that high, and so it almost feels like you're sitting on a normal toilet. Just an idea if you're interested. Okay, heat options. We talked about the space usage, how we're going to need a lot of space if we have a wood stove, and less so for hot water on demand, less so for a propane heater, a wall-mounted propane heater. But the propane is a really neat way to go for heat, because that propane can also be used for your stovetop and your hot water on demand. You know, it has so much utility if you go with propane. It's, you know, it's a fossil fuel, but it's a little less caustic than gas, and it stores really well. You know, in those tanks, it stores really well, unlike gasoline. So a default for the efficient tiny house for all the heat requiring components is propane. It works great. Electric, on the other hand, unless you're tying in to someone else's 30 or 50 amp service, you know, you're not going to want to use electricity like you normally would at the house. So you wouldn't have baseboard heating, you wouldn't have electric heat, not for the long haul, you know. Now, as far as electricity goes, and solar is a wonderful complement to everything I just explained. So all the heat requiring components, if you put them on propane, or you had a wood stove and everything else was on propane, then all of the other electrical requirements could rely on a solar panel system if you're in a location where you have a nice open arc of sunlight, right? So we get this question all the time, well, can we use solar? And, you know, well, yeah, sure, but you're going to have to choose your parking space based on what you have for sunlight. And the way to get through the winter is you have several batteries that you're going to be recharging, and so you'll always have a battery available that's already recharged, even on some gray days. But that electricity, say for example on 400 watts plus the system we talked about with the propane, you could power the LED lights and your desktop computer and a small refrigerator, which I think is kind of neat. So you could be off-grid with that sort of formula. But the trick is combining things. And speaking of combining things with water, this is, you know, again, we can do it RV style and have a connection to a hose like you would with a standard RV. So you pull up to someone else's hose, you connect to their hose, you can prevent it from freezing by getting one of those electrified ones, which will ensure it doesn't drop, the water doesn't drop below a certain temperature. Like, you know, you have to water animals in the winter, right, at the farm, so there are these heated hoses. And that's the easiest way for water. But then as an option, you know, at certain times when we're getting lots of rain, we could be catching the water too. We can capture the water catchment systems with gutters and holding tanks and filters ideally. And then we're going to need a pump to get that water up to a certain PSI pressure to run through the hot water on demand. Sorry, it's all like, there's a lot of steps to this. But I want to let you know, though, that having a tiny house on wheels and have it work really well is a multifaceted endeavor. There's a lot of gestalt. There's a lot of planning around this. There's, you know, planning to know your hobbies and your priorities, what you're going to keep and what you're going to have to give away. You're going to have to give away just about everything, by the way. So it's very important to know first what you love and kind of run with that. So for example, if you're a person who has a shoe collection, you love your shoes, they're not going away, you're planning that tiny house around that collection. And that's not so funny because I bet you everyone here has some odd thing that they collect. I'm seeing some sheepish looks. That you couldn't give up. You know, you wouldn't give up, and that's fine. You just design the tiny house around that. And sometimes those requirements have a great bearing on the layout. For example, if someone loves to cook and that's everything to them, the cooking is, you know, they have to have a 4-burner stove, they have to have an oven, then voila, they have a longer tiny house and they probably have less space to entertain or sort of hang out in. Did I cover utilities well enough? There's the carpenter. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering about going back to the propane. People use the old gas lamps for lighting. You see them mount on the wall.
Yeah, Well, no, he's asking about gas lighting. I would say for safety's sake, we probably wouldn't generally use gas lighting, but LEDs are so darn efficient, you know, and the configurations of LEDs, the strings of them, they're so flexible and versatile now. Just try to get a good quality one, and they'll last for a very long time and use very little electricity. Probably stay away from the lamp, but you know, if that's something you love and you have an antique that you'd really like to put to use, then, you know, you could use that.
Well, I lived in a house for a while that had no electricity in the house, but lighting it worked great.
Right,
And it was, you know, like you said, building on a propane system.
right,
It has, you could have heat, you could have hot water,
right,
everything.
right. Having something else run off of propane, including lamps, that's very possible. Yep. Anything else? Oh, okay. Okay, locating parking is one of the biggest challenges, and when I say parking, this usually means a permanent living space for a tiny house. And honestly, New England, we're a little behind. We're always a little tougher to change. You know that, right? So I'm going to tell you what people do instead of what is legal or not. I'm just going to tell you what people do. People hide. People stay in their parents' or grandparents' driveways. People will stay in someone's land and rent a room in the house where the tiny house is parked. Now, fortunately in New Hampshire, there's a pretty cool attitude about, mind your own business, because I'm making trouble myself over here, so I'm certainly not going to pick on you over there. This is great. This happens to work in our favor. However, in a very developed area, you really can't do that, or it's very difficult. I have young people from Somerville, Mass. Asking me all the time, where can I put a house in Somerville, Mass? Like, what are you going to do with the compost? You want a compost, darling. What are you going to do with the compost? It's sad but true. The alternative is great for the city folks, and that is simply to push on micro housing. Where they take an old warehouse and they build tiny micro units in there. And what a great community that could be. With common areas, low rents, or purchase prices, condos, etc. So there are options for city dwellers. But back to parking, people are trying to get things going where there are year-round campgrounds, but seasonal campgrounds are rather expensive. So the campgrounds that are trying to go year-round, you want to look for ones that have a mentality of a tiny house community, knowing that they're contending with folks that don't have much money or are not interested in spending a lot of money. And this particular one, this tree farm in Vermont, is interested in making progress. But it's been a bit more expensive than they had thought, getting the lines underground. This is an existing campground that's been around for a real long time. Nice folks, but the finances to get it to be year-round aren't quite there yet. But if you looked into it, they'd be happy to take your name, Elizabeth and Ben, and that's the young couple that took over from his parents. Other than that, there's a few popping up and not that many. Another thing too is, that sometimes on farmland they can have migrant housing, so you might be able to rent a space at a farm. Now, to go to purely legal means that you can bet on, that you can be assured of, you go to the zoning you go on the website and you go to a town and you check their zoning bylaws and you put in the search terms RV, because think of this as an RV if it's done correctly, or mobile home, and find out what the restrictions are for living in those. Now, some towns are really cool, and they'll say, they won't have any zoning at all. There's no restrictions. Do what you want. And then other towns will say 30 days only, like Gloucester, Mass. is 30 days. Or some other towns will say 2, maybe even 3 years while you're building a regular house. You can do that. But that is something that you'll have to do on your own. So if you're in the market to buy land where you can have a tiny house on wheels, first go to the towns of interest and check on their zoning and make sure that it's going to be okay. Now, progress is a little slow, but it is happening because people like us are pushing. And what we believe the tiny house community, we'll call it the community, us builders and do-it-yourselfers, we're thinking that there'll be compromises made. So of course towns want us to pay taxes, and well, we should. They have an infrastructure, they have schools, they need taxes to support these entities. So we can't expect to just escape, payment. And we can expect also to live safely and cleanly and have a sanitary, septic arrangement. These things we should do, right? But, the compromise might mean that instead of a full-blown residential tax, which is in some towns is quite high, real estate taxes in New Hampshire, maybe there'll be a midpoint, a compromise, understanding that people need affordable housing. And the government gets that. And a lot of towns fully acknowledge that they want to find affordable housing. So I think that the future is pretty bright. And if it wasn't, I wouldn't be here today. But it's not all settled by any means. Oh, yeah, this is a good organization. So American Tiny House Association, it's a nonprofit, and they do have membership fees. It's like $35 a year. We're members, and they just present news and progress on policy. So it's a great thing to be involved with. Very neutral. I can't recommend them enough. So when you're looking through things and you're getting lots of sales pitches and getting starry-eyed over some of the designs, all of that's a lot of fun. But if you want to get to brass tacks on policy and what's actually happening across the country, this organization is a good place to go look for information. So that concludes the presentation. I'm very happy to take any questions. I'll do my very best to answer you. And if I can, I'll try to find an answer for you. Oh. Yes?
What advice or recommendations do you have for someone who's potentially considering purchasing a resale tiny home? So a tiny home that's already been built.
The woman's asking about buying a tiny house that's already been built, and if you want to do that, the recommendation would be to see if they have some sort of paper trail of documentation of how they did things. Especially nice if they had electricians and plumbers involved, that's not always the case. But see if you can get some background information, receipts and stuff. Without actually going into the building and finding out what's behind the walls, it's a little difficult. Yeah. And we had something happen to us, actually. We had contracted a company who's an RVIA manufacturer, and now we exceed that criteria for building. But back then, we hired some, no names mentioned, and only recently found out that the propane plumbing, the pipes were very poorly done, and the whole dang thing could have gone up in flames. So we caught this before it was sold, but it was devastating. And actually, so having that RVIA sticker is not an assurance that you're going to get something that's safe. Oh, I think, I know I should know this because I'm the project manager.
Like 8.5 feet by, let's say, 500?
Oh, well, okay, I can tell you better at like 20 feet of tiny house finished is about, no architectural intricacies, is about 45,000 plus turnkey. But usually it's upwards from that. That would be a real simple one.
So it's 20 feet.
20 feet long, yeah. Oh, sorry. I should have said the question. The question was, what is the cost per square footage, which I don't know. So instead I gave her an example of 20 feet. Other questions? You guys have been real patient. Yes, in the front?
Those parks you were showing us a couple of slides back, do they have the standard utility hookups and septic hookups?
Yeah, regarding the, Tree Farm Campground has hookups for 3-season, but they don't, not for year-round. So yeah, electricity, water, it's all there, but not for the wintertime, yet. Crossing our fingers for them. They're working real hard. Class dismissed? I don't know. Thank you so much for coming.